the watcher in the window. The small town of Green Hollow was quiet, unremarkable, and peaceful, until the strange occurrences began at 54 Maple Street. It was an old Victorian home, abandoned for years, sitting near the edge of town. The locals had plenty of tales about it, stories of ghostly apparitions, strange noises in the night, and lights flickering in the windows long after the last resident left. But these stories were mostly forgotten, swept aside by time and the town's unwillingness to dwell on the past. That is, until the Myers family moved in. Sarah Myers was excited for the change. After a grueling divorce, she had bought the house at a steal, eager to start fresh with her 9-year-old son, Danny. The house needed work, but it had a certain charm, and Sarah was determined to make it their new home. The first few days were uneventful. Sarah spent her time unpacking, while Danny explored the house, fascinated by the old architecture and the creaky wooden floors. But it wasn't long before things took a turn. It started with the feeling of being watched. Sarah would catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of her eye, a shadow in the hallway, a flicker in the mirror, only to turn and find nothing. At first, she brushed it off as her imagination, blaming it on stress and exhaustion. But Danny noticed it too. "Mum," he said one night after dinner, "I keep seeing someone watching me from the window." Sarah paused, her fork hovering above her plate. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" Danny pointed to the large window in the living room, his face pale. "From that window, there's a man. He's always staring at me." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She glanced at the window, expecting to see someone standing there, but it was empty, just the darkened backyard beyond the glass. "There's no one there, Danny," she said, trying to reassure him, and herself. "It's just your imagination." But Danny was adamant. "He's there, Mom, every night, watching." Sarah didn't know what to make of it. She didn't want to scare Danny, but the thought of someone or something watching her son was unsettling. She started checking the locks on the doors and windows every night, making sure the house was secure. But the feeling of being watched never left. Then came the whispers. Late at night, when the house was quiet, Sarah began to hear faint voices. They were soft, barely audible, like a distant conversation she couldn't quite make out. At first, she thought it was the wind, or maybe the old pipes in the house, groaning. But the whispers grew louder, more distinct, as if someone or something was speaking directly to her from the shadows. One night, Sarah was jolted awake by a sound, a loud thud from downstairs. Heart pounding, she grabbed her phone and quietly made her way down the creaky stairs. The house was dark, the only light coming from the pale moonlight streaming through the windows. As she stepped into the living room, her eyes were drawn to the window Danny had mentioned. There, standing just outside, was a shadowy figure, a man, tall and thin, with glowing eyes that seemed to bore into her soul. Sarah froze, her breath catching in her throat. The man didn't move. He just stood there, watching her, his eyes never leaving hers. Suddenly, there was a crash from upstairs. Sarah spun around, rushing up the stairs to Danny's room. She flung open the door, her heart in her throat. Danny was sitting up in bed, wide-eyed and pale, pointing to the window. "He's here, Mom," he whispered, his voice trembling. "He's inside." Sarah's blood ran cold. She turned to the window, and there, standing just beyond the glass, was the same shadowy figure. But this time, He was inside the house, watching them both. Without thinking, Sarah grabbed Danny and ran. They fled the house, not stopping until they were safely inside a neighbor's home. The police arrived, but found no sign of an intruder. No footprints, no broken windows, nothing. But Sarah knew what she had seen, and so did Danny. They never went back to 54 Maple Street. The house still stands there, empty once more. But locals say that if you walk by late at night, you can see the shadowy figure standing in the window, watching, always watching. The Forgotten Room. The Williams family had just moved into their dream home, a sprawling, old manor on the outskirts of town. It was a fixer-upper, but it had character, history, and enough space for their growing family. Mark and Beth Williams were excited to raise their 2 kids, Ella and Jack, in the grand old house. But there was something strange about the house, something that had been overlooked during the purchase. It wasn't mentioned in the listing, and none of the previous owners had brought it up. It was a room that didn't appear on any floor plan or blueprint of the house. It was Jack who found it. One afternoon, as the family was unpacking boxes, 7-year-old Jack came running down the stairs, his eyes wide with excitement. "Mom, Dad, I found a secret room." Mark and Beth exchanged puzzled glances. "A secret room?" Beth asked, following Jack upstairs. Jack led them to the far end of the second floor, to a small hallway they hadn't explored yet. At the end of the hall was an old wooden door, slightly ajar. Beth frowned. They had already walked through the entire house, but she didn't remember this door. Curious, they opened the door and stepped inside. It was a small, dusty room with no windows, tucked away in the corner of the house. The air was stale, and the room smelled of mildew and decay. It was completely empty, save for a single chair in the center of the room, facing the far wall. The wallpaper was peeling, and the floorboards creaked beneath their feet. "That's strange," Mark muttered, inspecting the room. This wasn't on the floor plan. Beth shivered. There was something unsettling about the room, though she couldn't quite put her finger on it. It felt wrong. They didn't think much of it at first. It was just an old, forgotten room, hidden away in a house that had seen better days. But that night, the nightmares began. Ella woke up screaming, saying she had seen a man standing at the foot of her bed, his face twisted and grotesque. Jack refused to sleep in his room, saying the voices in the walls kept whispering his name. And Beth began to feel it too, that strange, oppressive presence that seemed to emanate from the forgotten room. One evening, as they sat in the living room, the temperature in the house suddenly dropped. The lights flickered, and the air became thick and heavy. Mark and Beth exchanged nervous glances. Something wasn't right. Then, from upstairs, they heard it, a slow, creaking sound, like someone walking across the floor. Mark grabbed a flashlight and cautiously made his way upstairs. The sound grew louder, coming from the direction of the forgotten room. His hand shook as he reached for the door handle, pulling it open. The room was empty, but as he turned to leave, something caught his eye. The chair in the center of the room, was facing the opposite direction, as if someone had moved it. Mark's breath caught in his throat. He hadn't touched the chair. No one had. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind him. Mark spun around, his heart pounding in his chest. The temperature in the room dropped further, and the walls seemed to close in on him. From the shadows, he heard a voice, a low, guttural whisper. "Get out!" Mark didn't need to be told twice. He bolted from the room, slamming the door behind him. That night, The family packed their bags and left the house. They never returned, leaving the forgotten room and whatever lurked inside it, undisturbed. The house remains abandoned to this day, but locals say that if you stand outside late at night, you can sometimes hear the sound of a chair scraping across the floor, as if something or someone is still moving it, waiting for the next family to come. And the whispers never stop.